Our approach today was to take the idea of conversation pretty true to form, and are prepared, Luke and I, to converse with each other for 35 minutes. Having said that, we would absolutely love to engage all of you in the conversation. And it's hard to figure out how to do that. I appreciate when you're in the audience, like, do you wait for Jenny to just stop talking and then jump right in? Or in fact, will she invite me to say something? So if it's easiest, please use the chat. If you have a question, we'll try to capture it. One of us will be keeping our eye on it. We may invite you to share some of your own thoughts. But like I said, we can fill the time, but would love to take it in a direction that best services you. So to get us started, Luke and I thought we would just do some context setting, some introductions of ourselves, because we think we have interesting backgrounds, or at least it would give you a sense a little bit more about each of us. And then we'll move on to this topic of social innovation. Think a little bit about, what does that word mean? It might be a little buzzwordy, a little jargony. Can we all get on the same page? And then really think about what skills and competencies and attributes serve us, you, and your organizations best to be an active and impactful actor in this social innovation space, if that's what you wish. So to get started, my name is Jenny Beckler. I am a faculty member in the School of Public Administration. I have been very fortunate to have spent actually 4 or 5 years with public admin, but before that, 10 years with the Rose School of Business. And in that role, I spent a lot of time working with and teaching our Masters of Business Administration, our MBA students. Now today, funnily enough, as a member of the public admin, I actually get to teach BCom students every year, every semester, in fact, in one of our early innovation classes. So I'm a real big champion of our faculty. I love the kind of mixing of opportunities that exist both for students, but hopefully for alumni. And a small, or I don't know if it's interesting, but a little tidbit of background. I actually I'm a Dow alumni. My undergrad degree is in marine biology because I had 2 parents who were scientists. They were geologists, and so that was the path. But it wasn't the path for me. So my master's degree, I made a transition in. And so when I talk about my background, I actually talk about having a background in peace and conflict studies. And that is kind of at the micro level, organizational conflict, team conflict, but also at the macro level. And so I'm very interested in kind of in global conflict and how we bring together different actors to play in that space. So a lot of my work, if you can picture it, is imagine a soldier and an aid worker and a diplomat and a bureaucrat coming together in a really difficult operational space to try to achieve some shared outcomes. And it's not organic. It doesn't happen naturally. It actually has to be quite purposeful. And so that difficult kind of collaboration, which is so important, but so challenging, is really, I guess, what gets me excited. That's what I love teaching about. And it's what I love talking about. And we're going to weave some of that into this conversation about social innovation, which, if it's anything, is about tackling really complex problems. So that's my little intro. I'm going to turn it over to Luke. Luke, welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. I love your energy. This is the 2nd or 3rd time that Jenny and I have connected, and she's always very high energy. So it's kind of infectious. I'm a bit of an accidental social entrepreneur. I'm an intentional entrepreneur, I would say. I was the kid that was, finding his cousin's bicycle that had been left in the snowbank and abandoned, and then polishing it up and then selling it the next spring, and kind of continued to do that kind of lawn mowing, et cetera, my whole life. And got a Bachelor of Engineering at Dalhousie, and a few years later was really looking to work more with people, and so went and did a master's in public administration. And then when I started working in government from there, I started to miss that data and rigor from engineering and really felt it needed to be more embedded in public policy. And so started to work on that problem. And then I would kind of leave government and go start a company to work on it, sort of first from a consulting, and then I went back in government, and then I saw another problem, and then I left and I did a software consulting company. And I was working with Indigenous governments in the North around, they were doing consulting to try and track spending on education or housing stock, housing supply. And so much of the budgets from consultants were being spent on digging into bankers' boxes. And I thought, there has to be a better way here. We can use software for this. And so started a software company to help increase understanding of what was happening in their governments. And then more recently, I started a tech company called Proof, which is at the kind of forefront of bringing data into the public sector. It is now, we went from conceiving this idea on an island in Georgian Bay, Ontario, to it now being in every level of government in Canada. And then more recently, I've joined a firm called Davis Peer. And to Jenny's point, Davis Peer specializes in solving complex public and social problems. And so, for example, we're really involved with COVID rapid testing and COVID vaccines. And while I feel pretty grounded in my entrepreneurship background, Davis Peer has taught me a ton about social innovation. The firm runs these labs where they'll really dive into a problem like food security or climate change and really think about how social innovation can help with those problems. So I'll maybe pause there on my background. And before we get too much further, I'd ask Jenny, how do you define social innovation?
Such a good question, Luke. And I think my one caveat, I'm going to be careful not to put caveats around everything, is that there are dozens, there's hundreds of definitions that we can use. And I wouldn't encourage our conversation today with the community that's here to get too bogged down in what it means. But I think we spoke, Luke, about just maybe giving a little bit of a context setting for folks. And so the definition that I go to most often with my students, especially, is a definition that speaks to the following pieces, right? So when I talk about social innovation, what I'm talking about is a new solution to a social problem, and we can unpack that a bit. And that the new solution should in some way be more efficient, effective, sustainable, or just than what is existing or what's already out there. And that that solution, once implemented, generates value that primarily accrues to society. So it's not to say there can't be profit or for profit in social innovation, but it has to sit alongside this pursuit of the social good, this development of social value for communities. So that's kind of where I start. The second part of that is it can really look like almost anything, right? It could be a new product, it could be a new digital solution, it could be a new policy, it could be a new program, it could be new service delivery, it could be a social movement. Like it's very wide and all encompassing in that way. And so one of the things I would love for folks here on our call to think about is, oh, I'm doing that. I do that now. I do that, on this board, or my organization does that. And really think about what you might like to contribute or the questions you'd like to ask. So that's kind of the scene setting. If I was to just poke on one part of that definition that I'd like to emphasize, there's an incremental aspect about social innovation. And I think that's important to think about. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when we talk about innovation, we talk about radical innovation, disruptive innovation, like the arrival of the smartphone, for example, right? And some forms of social innovation could look that disruptive. But there's a lot of work done by a lot of organizations in a lot of spaces. That's what we would call kind of continuous improvement, carving out wedges, pieces, dimensions of a really wicked problem to just try to move a meter a little bit, to try to enhance social value and the social good by just a little bit. And that's not to say we shouldn't aim big, but it's just a reminder that there's a lot of really important work being done at this kind of not smaller level, but maybe not in the way we often think about innovation when we talk about it. And so, Luke, I'm curious a little bit with that scene set. Does that align with what you think about when you think about social innovation, or are there different pieces?
Yeah. There's a couple of things that I would build on. I think that you talked about it being a benefit to society, and I think that is a key part of it. And I think we're seeing like a great example of how social innovation may be tracked in Nova Scotia with the new government announcing that they will be tracking quality of life and subjective well-being in Nova Scotia. So how are people doing? And I think that's kind of an evolution from only tracking economic GDP, and other countries have done this. So I think if you're doing a social innovation in some way, I think you should be contributing to the movement of those quality of life indicators. And I think the second thing that I think is important that you were talking about is like, you don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, you don't need to just have something totally revolutionarily innovative. You just want to be bringing something new. Jenny, as you said, like it could be a process or a technology or a product. I think that like the best innovation, like, whichever innovator you look at, they've probably got their idea from seeing it play out in some other jurisdiction or some other domain. And I think, like, for example, Davis Peer is doing an employment innovation through a project called Aspire Atlantic. And what they're doing is they're taking a model from the United States called Work Advance, which has been really tested in the States, where they take low-wage workers and they support them in career readiness, occupational skills training, placement, and retention. And so we're going to take 150 low-wage workers and run them through a process. Now, it's not totally new because it's been launched in the United States and tested there, but it's new to Atlantic Canada. It's new to these particular trade groups. And so we think it is social innovation. And I think that's an example, like you're not just going to imagine like some crazy new idea. I think you really need to get in there, roll up your sleeves, and then you'll start to identify like, oh, to Kim's comment earlier, like, oh, the wind is kind of fading and steam engines are coming in, and there's analogies like that in the social sector. So with that said, I'd be curious to all the participants to kind of open up the chat box on Zoom here. And what I'd like you to put in there is knowing a bit about what social innovation is. What would you be interested in applying social innovation to? What is a social challenge that's really important to you that you would like to try putting social innovation to improving?
Right. And so it's really kind of what are the social problems that kind of either keep you up at night or get you up in the morning, because it's actually the work that you do that you're thinking about all the time. We're keen to just see where the room is coming from on this. And as we wait to see if anybody populates our chat, I will just say another really important characteristic of social innovation is that it tends to be built on very powerful, very challenging, but very powerful collaborative activities. And so it's not to say that you can't have a startup that's looking at a very specific wedge of a problem and doing fantastic things. Absolutely. But some of the most kind of meaningful, impactful, and also scalable initiatives are the ones where we actually see this powerful weaving of public sector, different levels of government, community organizations, private sector like consulting companies, industry, and then the academic institutions. And it's bringing actually together the different perspectives, the different worldviews that can be a really, really important part about social innovation. And then within that is this idea of collaborating or co-creating, coming up with solutions with the communities that are most impacted by the problems, right? And having that very inclusive, critically inclusive aspect to the work that's being done. And I'm just looking, we have a couple of things: climate change, circular economy from Ken, thanks for that. Food security from Emily. And I actually would maybe look to Luke in a minute just to reflect a bit about some of the food security projects that Davis Pier's been involved with, that the lab's been involved with, which do, I think, a really effective job at speaking to certain aspects of innovation, including this idea of like, sometimes you just need to get things done. Like you can't plan constantly. You just need to go out, experiment, try some things, see what works. And I suspect Luke will have some things to bring from that. And actually, maybe I'll bounce to Luke if that's something you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, I can do that. I think one of the things that, I'd like to talk about a bit here is the skills that are needed to be a social innovator, and perhaps in keeping with this being a management school, and so one of the views that I have around what's needed is like a deep curiosity, and maybe that's a personality trait, but it builds on some skills. So when we run labs at Davis Pier, we do like social science research. We want to understand what the best practices out there. That's how we found Work Advance was this model in the States. We want to really understand the competitive landscape. We don't want to just produce the same solution that's already been produced, not only because it's not innovative, but because it's like a duplication of resources and it just won't be an effective way to move the dial. Like if you want to deploy the same solution, join an organization that's deploying that solution. And I think that that's really important to developing an effective business case to make this sustainable. Jenny, I'm curious your thoughts on what skills are needed.
Yeah, I one of the things I'm always really careful about when in this kind of space that I'm in right now is to make sure I don't frame things in an overly academic way, because that's a lot of my experience. What's so fantastic is Luke's ability to reflect, not just with his work at Davis Pier, but kind of a lived experience himself of how things actually play out in the workplace. But in response to that question, what skills help us or as individuals, but also as organizations, really have an impact in this space. One of the concepts we think talk a lot about, at least with our students and the young professionals who are leaving our programs now, is this idea of human-centered design or design thinking. And it is in its own way a little bit of a jargony concept, although it's not brand new. It's been around for decades, and its approach to innovative problem solving. But why it lends itself incredibly well to social innovation is that it's built on a couple of kind of core, I guess you would call them principles or pillars. And so human-centeredness is the first thing it's built upon, which is that, a lot of people out there are brilliant and talented and can invent new things, new technology, new products, new anything, right? But sometimes we invent without fully appreciating or understanding the problem, people impacted by the problem, people who are going to adopt or use or buy sometimes the solution that we're thinking about. And so human-centered design says when we're designing new solutions, we should really be focused first and foremost on the user, on the people, on the community who are experiencing the problem. And that in understanding the user, we have a much richer appreciation for the problem. And in fact, may start to see the problem differently than we did at the outset. Right. And so, this is one of those, design thinking or human-centered design is often presented as a process, a series of steps. We can talk about that if anybody in the room is interested, but it is that pillar of human-centeredness that I think is so critical in a social innovation space. And it also, this whole approach also includes concepts or principles such as kind of really valuing experimentation, and with experimentation, the idea of like quick and rapid failure, right? The idea that, okay, I have this idea, instead of making it perfect and then executing it, should we not test really early iterations of it, find out sooner than later whether it's going to work or not, whether it works for the community and the people, for sure. And if we find out it doesn't, that's a win. And that's a real mindset shift, right? That is hard. That's hard for organizations and individuals to kind of get their heads around. But human-centered design really encourages us to not just talk about experimentation, testing, feedback, prototyping, just at a surface level. It's like, what does it really mean to embody those things in our problem-solving exercises, right? And that's a stretch. Like that is not organic or intuitive to a lot of us. And so that's another reason that I love the idea that maybe you're thinking a little bit about, what skills do I want to become better at or develop, or what new things do I want to read about? I would encourage anybody who's not already read about it to really do a little bit of reading around design thinking, human-centered design, and see if it's appealing to you. And Luke, maybe now bouncing to you, in practice, how do you see human-centered design play out in the social innovation work that you do?
Yeah, when I learned about human-centered design through working at Davis Peer, at first it was a foreign concept, but then I was like, oh, this has been drilled into my head as an entrepreneur. Y Combinator, which is one of the leading startup accelerators in the world, has this famous plaque that just says, write code, talk to users. And that's it, just talk to users. It's don't do fake work, they call it. Like, don't go perfect your logo and don't go, get business cards. Like, talk to users and then build something. Put it in front of the users and just continue that cycle. Another way that I've heard this talked about is you want to find the person's hair on fire problem. So if you're looking to solve the problem and you're like, oh, maybe we'll make your shirts whiter or whatever. It's like, well, maybe that's a priority today, but like my hair's on fire. I need a fire extinguisher. Like this is a real problem and I need it solved. A great example of how that has played out in the work at Davis Peer is like, we did a project with Feed Nova Scotia looking at food security. And one solution that has been often put forward in that space is like, oh, we'll teach people how to cook. We'll give them cooking classes. But if you stop and you talk to somebody who's struggling with food insecurity, it's not that they don't know how to cook. It's they don't have time. It may be financial. There's a million barriers, but it's not necessarily that they don't know how to cook. So if you kind of really listen to the users, you'll think about new solutions. Jenny, one of the things that comes up for me when I think about social innovation is around collective impact. And again, to use a buzzword, but I know that you have done in your life a lot of work looking at, you talked about it earlier, around an aid worker and a diplomat and a bureaucrat. I'm curious how you see kind of cross-organization work as being a part of social innovation.
Yeah, and I want, again, be careful a little bit to not say this is the only way to do social innovation work, but I am increasingly convinced through kind of lived experience and my own observations that our path to meaningfully and inclusively tackling some of the most complex problems that we face, it is not a solo exercise. And yet a lot about innovation, just the innovation culture in general, is we create, we invent, we commercialize, we have to hold on tight because there's financial paradigms around that. And so the more people you bring in to your solution generating exercise, the more that tends to move a little bit away. It doesn't have to move completely away, but it does move away. And so that's kind of one of the challenges of bringing kind of multiple actors to a table to try to do this really powerful problem solving. But I think the other part is just it's a bit of a mind shift. And I think about this myself. I was brought through a certain educational system. I teach in that system now. I was the oldest child. I had perfectionist tendencies from the beginning. I was rewarded for getting things right my whole life. And yet now I find myself like in these spaces where, there's not one solution because there's not one definition of success. Right. And once you have multiple definitions of success, how do you bring together people that you absolutely need because they're either working in that space with you? So to pretend you're not there, well, that's silly. But also because it is possible together, if you could shape a shared vision, even allowing for your differences, that together you can do something that on your own you can't, which is really, I guess, an undercurrent or like a foundational point of collaboration. And how do you let everybody's kind of identities and priorities persist while still rallying around this one problem or specific problem that you're trying to tackle? And I think that we all have different tolerances for that. And so it starts with the individual, right? When you're coming onto these teams or joining these ventures or just becoming part of the conversation, appreciating that, okay, I'm here because I bring this expertise, this worldview, this experience, and that's important. I'm not apologizing for that. I shouldn't have to hide behind that. But if I only hold to that and don't create any space for any other conversations, then there's not really going to be a conversation. Right. And then you make that decision. Do I do it on my own, or do we try to see what we can create together? And so there's always this conversation, I think, for organizations, new, large, big, old, public, private, whatever, to say, how well equipped are our individuals, our talent for doing this kind of work, and how well equipped are we as an organization, therefore, for doing it? And I think a lot of organizations talk about wanting to be involved with social innovation, but haven't yet really asked those hard questions about, what do I look for in my talent, in my teams? What do I look for in my organization? Once I figure out what I need to look for, how do I develop it if it's not there? How do we prioritize that so that we can participate in these problem-solving ventures in a really impactful and productive way? And it's not to say that social innovation should be tension-free. It should absolutely be full of tension. It is in the tension that the different perspectives will emerge, but it can't be unproductive, right? And so where do you strike that balance?
Yeah. It's super interesting that you talk not just about where organizations stand in collaboration, but also where individuals, like you referred to yourself as where you're in your birth order, you know what I mean? And how those identities can help make it challenging to bring shared visions or develop shared visions. Jenny, you and I first connected over the Management Without Borders program, where I had Proof, the startup that was based at Volta. So there's two organizations. You out of Dalhousie run this program with Management Without Borders and help provide support to our technology startup through the students. And I'm curious, you've done that now, I don't know how many tens or hundreds of organizations. I'd be curious to hear what Management Without Borders has taught you or your students about social innovation.
Yeah, it's interesting for those, and I appreciate, because we have the BCom audience here, and Management Without Borders is a course that our MBA students can take alongside our MPA students, other graduate students, and our other graduate programs. Essentially, we bring that class together, and those students form interprofessional teams. So we create teams that are all of a sudden full of different professional expertise, different undergraduate expertise, absolutely different worldviews. And so that's kind of the team problem solving space. And then we kind of pair them with partners, like Luke is saying, his startup, for example, or other community organizations. And they could be not-for-profits, but they could be government organizations, small businesses, small startups, that kind of thing. Those partners come with, I don't want to call it always a problem. They might be coming with, like, we have an opportunity, or we think it's an opportunity. And then our students work in a team to consider, contemplate, assess the merit of that opportunity, or assess the extent of the challenge and how it might be overcome. And that's kind of a broad exploration. And they do that over one semester. And it is an imperfect exercise. Actually, I think a lot about innovation when I think about, like, the execution of that course, which is, and sometimes it works incredibly powerfully. And other times I watch the teams get bogged down in all sorts of dynamics that are as much about their differences as they are about the difficulty of the project, for example, right? And I don't know, you'd have to ask the students, but I think there's merit to having that experience as part of their education before going out into the workplace, to get as close to a real world kind of problem solving exercise as possible. But beyond that, I think, and Luke, you can speak to this maybe as having been one of the partners, is I think it emphasizes the importance of, if it's about coming up with, like, novel recommendations, novel approaches, new ideas, the power of bringing together really kind of young, exciting, dynamic, at the beginning of their career individuals to work with a organization who might be a little bogged down in their problems, like they've already become quite internalized, just that fresh set of eyes. I mean, that's such an important theme, I think, in social innovation, is bringing fresh sets of eyes to problems, and not hold on so tightly that you're almost removing any opportunity to get feedback, even if that feedback is hard to hear. So that's one of the connections I make often between that particular course and the fantastic group of partners that we've worked with.
Yeah, there's two things that I'd bounce off there, and then maybe after this we could go to questions and see if people have any. The one is just, you spoke to the many different views that get brought in, and I think that when we run these innovation labs, whatever space it's in, climate and poverty or food security, we bring in these multidisciplinary teams, many of them DAL grads. So we have DAL MBAs, DAL MPAs, we have behavioral scientists, we have researchers, we have privacy experts who've come from DAL's health informatics program. And they're all looking at the same problem, trying to figure out how to make something work. And it brings a lot of tension in terms of, like, the different thinking, but then that really brings powerful solutions. And then the second thing is just this organizational piece. So we went into a community of Amherst and did about 300 interviews, like human-centered design, with people about food insecurity. But we also looked at local community groups. Feed Nova Scotia was a major partner. This project was funded by the Department of Community Services. And all of these organizations had kind of different approaches to tackling the problem. But when you bring them all around a common table, you can really reveal a lot. Whereas people may have been working in silos, you can really open up what's possible. So with that, I'd be curious if there are questions from the audience about some of the stuff that Jenny and I have been talking about.
And while we see, I did notice that when I was when I was summarizing some of the ideas that were there, I did miss Lonnie's note about kind of the importance of equalizing access to all. And I wanted to maybe jump on that for a minute while we see if there's other questions. I think it's such an important aspect because it's important, I think, in social innovation spaces to not look at kind of category descriptions of the biggest social problems. Right. If you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them, and they are very kind of well branded: poverty, like health, shelter, very kind of climate change, those kinds of things. And we tend to say, oh, that's the problem. But in fact, it's just the description of a huge bucket of problems. And it's really important to remember that in every community and across communities, the problems are experienced differently by different, I don't want to say segments, let's say communities within that population. And just because the problem may be getting solved or the meter may be moving for one group doesn't mean it's moving at all for other groups, right? And this brings us into situations where whereby maybe we're missing that. You know, we think we're making progress one way, but in fact, there are voices not being heard or not being represented. And so one of the things I do love about human-centered design is this imperative that's put on the process that says, you know, you don't do this work by sitting at your desk, right? You don't ask people to come to you, you go to them. Right, you're trying to build empathy, you're trying to get appreciation for lived experience, you know, and there are ways to do that that demonstrate strong commitment, a greater emphasis on authentic inclusion. Like there's lots of things that really need to be taken in consideration when we're working in this space. And I don't pretend at all, I'm so far from being perfect in any way. I think it's about being purposeful in our thinking and remembering that some of the problems we set out to solve are not ones we ourselves are experiencing. And what does that mean, right? How do we talk about it? Who do we have to include? Who do we need to involve? And so those are just some of the things I wanted to wrap up around Lonnie's really important point